Glitches and bugs are an almost inevitability with games. For almost as long as they've existed, there's always been a way of breaking them, owing to a flaw in the code that no one working on it managed to catch, often ending up as being either a lighthearted joke or as a way to help speedrunners finish the game faster. But every once in a while, you get a glitch that not only stops you dead in your tracks, it can sometimes render all of your progress completely futile through no fault of your own, or because of one incredibly damaging crack the devs didn't notice and pave over. So how about we take a look at a handful of games you can snap in half in ways that not only render them unbeatable, but by which the methods of doing so are surprisingly easy, and in one case doesn't even require the player to do anything to trigger it. These are the developer Oversights that broke games. Let's start things off on a small scale with a mistake that's easy to miss along with simple to fix, which can be found within the Phantasy Star series, a lineup of science fantasy RPGs made by Sega which released across the Master System and Mega Drive, with them nowadays more so being remembered for their later online spin-offs. Specifically, we're interested in 1990's Phantasy Star 3 Generations of Doom, which despite receiving praise for its multi-generational and branching storyline, is often regarded as the black sheep of the series due to how different it is from the games that released both before and after, which was likely a result of the game being made by a new team after a majority of the series' original devs had moved on to make what would eventually become the original Sonic the Hedgehog, along with it also being a victim of a rushed development cycle, with one of the easiest ways to spot this being the multiple places the game can be broken through the use of an escape pipe, an item which allows you to instantly escape a dungeon. Now, the first time you can break the game with the teleporting ocarina is right at the start, as by immediately darting for a shop, selling your boots, and using the money to buy one, once you've been thrown into the castle dungeon not long after, you can immediately break out using the escape pipe. But due to this breaking the planned sequence, you can't actually progress any further and are pretty much stuck. Though luckily the devs seem to have caught on to this bug, as talking to the king will lead to an error message commending you for your out-of-the-box thinking, but also requests that you reset the game. However, whilst they may have caught on to this flub, that doesn't mean it's the only place you can do something like this, as if you're able to use one at the start of the game's second generation after choosing to play as Niall, you're transported back to the dungeon you just beat, but with all the enemies replaced with chirpers, and by being the boss for a second time, you can effectively skip the entire second generation and go straight to the third. Though if you want to actually finish the game, you have to pick the second option of who to marry, as you're missing plot important items you need to beat the other. Provided you didn't skip Gen 2, the exploit can also be used to skip part of Adon's story, as it will take you to Azora where you can grab the parts needed to go to Ren. As for the other heroes, they either teleport you right next to where you start in the case of Ayn and Aaron, meanwhile Sean and Chris will be taken to the Techna dungeon, which results in another softlock, as without the parts needed to escape the area, they're effectively stranded, forcing a reset. Obviously, none of these are particularly egregious, especially since in the worst case scenario, all you have to do to fix the problem is reset the console, but the fact that there's multiple occasions where you can softlock or skip major chunks of the game owing to the devs not putting in a failsafe for an item you can get as early as 2 minutes in is frankly astounding, and just goes to show how crunched for time the people making it must have been. You know, if the plethora of unused items, stores, and enemies still on the cartridge weren't enough to give it away. Sticking with Sega for a bit longer, we have the original Sonic Adventure. The Blue Blur's bombastic debut into 3D, not counting the various times he kind of did already through side games and spin-offs, which still holds some grounding as one of Sonic's better releases. If you can ignore the horrible English dub, Big's campaign doing irreversible damage to the reputation of fishing minigames, and the fact that every time it's been re-released, it's somehow gotten worse. Now, jokes aside, for the most part, the original Dreamcast version of Adventure 1 is generally well put together. Though given the general nature of Sonic games, there's always bound to be some kind of glitch or collision issue that can potentially disrupt your playthrough, with the one I want to focus on being located in the first hub area, Station Square, and in particular a small district that's most notable for being the area that contains Casinopolis, which serves as Sonic's third level, along with both Tails and Knuckles' second. Now, normally the area isn't accessible at the start, which is explained due to the casino only opening at night, but it is possible to get there earlier via glitching through the walls of the neighboring train station. For Knuckles, this requires using the Burgerman statue to clip into the train station, followed by gliding into the wall at a certain angle to clip through the building. As for Sonic, he can clip through by jumping between the wall and the Burgerman statue, and in Tails' case, you can just fly through the station's ceiling, and from there you can enter and beat the level a fair amount earlier than you were supposed to. However, upon completing the stage as Sonic or Tails, you'll realize that because you never triggered the event that unlocks the doors to let you in, you're now basically stuck in this small pocket of town, with the only way out being either a fairly precise flight path off of the stairs to the train station with Tails, or a series of precise spin dashes and jumps for Sonic. But it's with Knuckles where things get a bit more interesting, as immediately after Casinopolis, he's taken to one of the game's many Tikal sequences, where the story is briefly stopped to show the distant past of Angel Island, which over the course of the game provides background lore on both Tikal and Chaos. The general path being that you're supposed to find her to watch a cutscene before being brought back to the present. However, owing to some kind of bug related to the sequence break, the cutscene trigger just stops working, meaning Knuckles is now effectively trapped in the past with the only way out being to restart your playthrough. And in case you're wondering, no, these were not fixed in the various director's cut releases. And if you're shocked by that, then please consult your nearest Sonic fan to learn why that port is so much worse than the original in almost every conceivable way. Now immediately, this process is a bit more out of the way than the previous entry, and it's unlikely that a player would encounter this on a first playthrough, with maybe the slight exception of Tails. But I still think it's kind of funny how you can technically trap yourself, or in Knuckles' case, completely softlock your playthrough before you've even beaten the intended first level, owing to the devs either missing some collision issues or just not considering the possibility that anyone would try to play them out of order. But hey, at least this one doesn't break the game entirely, and if you're not skilled enough to get back out, you only need to delete the save, which isn't that much of a pain given how early into the story you'd be regardless of who you're playing as. These next two, however, aren't nearly as kind. So, what could be worse than an oversight forcing you to start your playthrough over? How about one that makes it so you can just never play the game again? Enter Age of Empires, a long-running series of historical RTS games which has seen new releases and expansions almost every year since 1997, with us specifically being interested in 2006's Age of Empires: The Age of Kings for the DS, which itself is effectively a port of 1999's Age of Empires 2. The campaign consisting of 5 sections, each of which is made up of 5 or 6 missions, with them all having you play as one of the game's various factions. It overall getting a pretty positive reception, with the only major negative feedback being the lack of online play. However, Age of Kings isn't remembered for any of these highlights, and instead is mostly known for one particularly nasty bug that can completely invalidate your purchase. So what exactly is this mistake? mistake that can completely ruin the game? Well, for some bizarre reason, if you named your profile something that is 3 characters long or shorter, when you decided to save, the game just completely bricks, rendering it unplayable, and the cartridge is now effectively a paperweight. I say for some reason because from what I could find, no one seems to really know why exactly this happens, including the actual developers who, instead of trying to fix the issue, instead just included a warning in future prints advising the player to name their empire something at least 4 characters long, though there's nothing stopping you from still letting the game implode on itself because you named your army Bob, as they didn't even put in any kind of restriction within the game to stop you from doing so. In other terms, they did the absolute bare minimum, and it's thanks to efforts like that which is why Age of Empires DS isn't remembered as a great strategy game to play on the go, and is instead known as the DS game that shits itself if your name is too short, along with being the prime example of how even the smallest and seemingly inconsequential thing can completely topple your empire. Now, whilst I'd say this is the worst outcome you'd face out of everything I'm talking about in this video, there is still the argument that given this is a known issue now, and the devs did include a warning about it in future prints, it's debatable that you could put some of the blame on the actual player for the game going wrong, as you could for the 2 previous sections. This last one, however, has no one to blame but the people who worked on it. This one is less the fault of the programmers, or really anyone on the original development team, and more so how the people responsible for localizing the game for other regions through one small slip-up accidentally made it impossible to complete. The game in question being Tokyo Xtreme Racer 3, the 2003 entry in the long-running Shutoku Battle series, which is a long line of arcade-style races made by developer Genki, the franchise having seen only the occasional international release, which have been handled by multiple different publishers, with Tokyo Xtreme Racer being the name used for entries that were published internationally by either Crave Entertainment or Genki themselves, with this entry in particular seeing various races and gangs competing with each other across Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya following the defeat of the 13 Devils 2 years prior during the events of Tokyo Xtreme Racer 0. Now, as mentioned earlier, the mistake we're interested in doesn't crop up in the original Japanese release, and instead is only found in the American version handled by Crave, which outside of the obvious change of the game now being in English, saw one major difference from the Japanese version, namely that all monetary values in the game were divided by 100, as an attempt to make the in-game currency be more in line with the US dollar than Japanese yen. Well, almost all of them. You see, there's actually one spot they missed when converting the currency values, namely with the required amount of money needed to go against 2 of the game's wanderers. These being races you can find dotted around the various maps not associated with any of the gangs, who require you fulfill some kind of specific requirement before you can challenge them, with the opponent Exotic Butterfly only being challengeable when you have at least 20 million credits on hand, along with Whirlwind Fanfare, who requires you possess at least 100 million credits. A feat that in the Japanese version will certainly take a while, but is more than manageable, made unnecessarily more difficult in the American version, as by the currency conversion used, you should have only needed 200,000 and 1 million credits respectively. But okay, let's say for the sake of argument that you did grind out enough races to try and hit the values needed in order to race these 2. Well, whilst you still can do that for Exotic Butterfly, owing to that currency conversion, the maximum amount of credits you can possibly earn is now 99,999,990 credits. meaning it is flat out impossible to get the amount of money needed to challenge Whirlwind Fanfare, which in turn also locks you out from being able to race against the game's final opponent, Unknown, who requires you beat all of the other racers. And if you didn't know, there's a total of 600 of them, meaning there's a chance someone managed to beat 598, only to discover that due to incompetence on the publisher's behalf, there's no way for them to even see the last two without the use of a cheating device or starting over from scratch with an imported Japanese copy. It being one big mess that could have been completely avoided if it wasn't for Crave's bizarre fear that Americans wouldn't understand the pricing of the cars if the values were based on the currency used by the country it's set in. Luckily though, a fan patch was released in 2024 which fixes the bug, finally allowing you to legitimately complete the game via emulation, just over 20 years after it originally released. Better late than never, I guess. We'll end things here for now, but I hope this video has showcased that whilst mistakes are an almost inevitability, it's always worthwhile to make sure you do your best to avoid them, as it only takes one small slip up to cause an immense amount of damage. Or alternatively, you could just give no care whatsoever to how something turns out and just hope years down the line that someone else will come in and fix the problem for you.